Hello, everyone, wherever you are. I'm Michael Gasser. I'm a member of the Coordinating Committee of the International Union of Scientists, an organization of scientists opposed to the destructive use of science and technology, especially for military purposes. Today, we're very fortunate to be joined by Cuban scientist Dr. Ernesto Estévez Rams to talk about Cuban science and the effects of 65 years of economic and political aggression by the US against Cuba, effects on science, as well as on the daily life of the Cuban people. Dr. Esteves Rams is a full professor at the University of Havana, where he graduated before completing his PhD at the University of Technology of Vienna. He's a scholar of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation and a member of merit of the Cuban Academy of Science. Many thanks for joining us, Ernesto, under the current difficult circumstances in Cuba. Our audience consists mainly of scientists from diverse fields, and they'd be interested to know a little about your background and your research.
Thank you very much, Michael, and I thank you for the opportunity of talking to a broad audience to this interview. And thank you for the nice introduction. And I would add to what you were saying that it's not only been an economical and political aggression against Cuba, it's also been a military aggression against Cuba. And we have had a number of episodes of sabotage, terrorist attacks, and we had Bay of Pigs. We have the October crisis, which we call it the October crisis in Cuba. In the United States, it's called the Mensal crisis. And we have other instances of military aggression in different forms, perhaps not as a open war, but in different forms from the United States against Cuba along these 60 years. So this is not something new. And I like how you frame that context because you talk about aggression. You don't talk about embargo. In Cuba, we don't call it an embargo. In Cuba, we call it a blockade. And actually, the name blockade is the official name by the United Nations, who has been approving a resolution in the last the last 20 years, asking for an end to this blockade, and that's the word is used in this resolution. So, by United Nations, the official term to refer to the United States' continuous aggression against Cuba is blockade. It's not embargo, and I think that's a important decision we have to make from the beginning. Um, Speaking about my background, as you said, I studied at the University of Havana, the physics faculty at the University of Havana, and I graduated in 1990. And then, to be more specific, 2 years after that, I went to the University of Technology in Vienna and did my PhD there, and I finished in 1996. And since then, I'm back in Cuba working at the physics faculty at the University of Havana until today. And I did my PhD in electron microscopy, especially transmission electron microscopy. And it was an interesting thing because when I came back, when I left to Vienna, there were several working transmission electron microscopes in Cuba in different scientific institutions. One at the University of Havana at the physics faculty. There were Soviet technology, which had a very good optic, but the electronic was not so good. And but while I was studying in Vienna, in Cuba happened what we call the special period, and that was a period that has a lot of parallel to what is going on now in Cuba. It was a very tough economical situation because the Soviet Union just collapsed, and with it, the whole Soviet bloc, and we lost from one day to the other around 80% of a trade of our commercial trade. And as a result of that, we also were in a very dire situation, and the gross domestic product felt really very, very heavy. And there were very strong fuel shortage. There were extended electricity outage, and but from let's say from my idea of doing scientific research back in Cuba, I get out of the plane, and then I find out there were no more electron microscopes in Cuba working. And at that point, I have to say that my colleagues and the people at the institute in Vienna where I was doing my PhD were very nice and very kind to donate to me an old but still functioning scanning electron microscope, which was not very well suited for research, but it was good enough for teaching. So in that sense, we could still do some teaching with the students of how to do at least scanning electron microscope, but no research. It was really not fit for research. So I had to shift a bit my research focus from electron microscopy to X-ray diffraction. And together with that, I also step up more my research in crystallography. And since I was working in Vienna, I was working in disorder, in defects in solids and so on. And I continued this path, but now using mostly X-ray diffraction and doing mathematical and theoretical work within disorder in crystallography. And I started working at an institute in Havana University, which is called the Institute of Material Science. And there we started working in this area. And I've been working in that since then up to today. But while I was working in crystallography and doing more and more mathematical and theoretical work, I shift my focus a bit towards using tools from information theory into crystallography and the study of disorder in crystallography, and especially the transition from order to disorder from the informational point of view, from the information theory point of view. And that, as it happens, and this is probably something familiar to some of the scientists who are listening, you start doing something, you start using something else as a tool to work on that, and then that something else at one point becomes the main focus of the main topic of your research. And that happened with information theory, which I linked, of course, with physics entropy and things like that. And then I started doing much and much more work on that field. And then at some point we started using all these things that we were doing. We started using it in other fields, especially in health research, and also a bit in other areas like energy, but also a bit in collaboration with the economic faculty, some bit in what is called econophysics and things like that. This is more like, say, like a fringe thing, but that's to give you an idea that then we started using in a much more broad context. And then today, I have a group who has grown over the years, and now we have two parallel venues of research. One is rooted in this original studies of material science and defects and physical properties in materials, which goes around X-ray diffraction and mathematical and theoretical crystallography. And then we have another venue of research within the group that is much more focused on information theory. And lately we have incorporated artificial intelligence and the mathematics of artificial intelligence. We're trying to understand what's going on inside these neural networks and this kind of mathematical constructions from information theory point of view, to see if we can shed light in how they work and then how can we optimize it and so on. But we've also been applying that to applications, especially in health research. We have very nice projects in that has to do with the heart. That's a very nice project in collaboration with a very important hospital in Cuba, which is called Hermano Mejias. We also have some research going on within neurodegenerative diseases, and we're very excited about these two projects. And I think we are making some very nice progress in this area. So that's more or less my background, and I think that will be common to a lot of the scientists who are listening to me right now, that you start with something and you end with something else, and science is just one thing. So, and we are scientists. So my background is physics, and I've been doing all these things all over the years.
Yeah, well, we went from crystals to information science to neurodegenerative disease. So I think almost everybody in our audience, including me, will have some commonality with your work. Before we get to the harmful effects on Cuban science from the decades of the US blockade, could you say a bit about the history of Cuban science and STEM fields in general since the revolution? So, what fields have been seen as priorities, and what do you consider to be the major achievements of Cuban science and engineering? And how has the nature of the political system, the nature of Cuban socialism, uh, affected the way science has progressed in ways that would be different under capitalism, with the emphasis on science for profit?
Yes, okay. To understand the context, or to understand my answer on the question, I have to give a bit of a context. Cuba before 1959 was an agricultural country, and we had mainly two crops. One which was overwhelming the most important one, which was the sugarcane production. That came from the time of Cuba as a Spanish colony, and we were one of the most important sugarcane producers in the world, and one of the biggest importation source of sugar in the United States. And all the economical life in Cuba, mostly all the economical life in Cuba, revolved around the sugarcane production. And the other crop was tobacco, which is world known, no? Famous, world known. Although the tobacco industry is very localized in Cuba, today it's more than one province, but the famous tobacco comes from one province. The production is not that big in the sense that this is a very specialized production, that it's based not in quantity but in quality. Cuban tobacco is considered the best tobacco in the world, and to keep that condition means you do everything in a special way, no chemicals, no this, no that, so the quality still keeps the high standard, but that means the production is not that high. Well, Cuba was an agricultural country, and that meant a lot of things for the social structure of Cuba. We had a very big rural population that lived in very bad conditions, and illiteracy was very common in that population. But in the country as a whole, illiteracy was quite high in the sense of, well, they say the numbers in 1958 was around, the numbers vary a bit on the studies, but let's say it was around 40 to 50%, up to 20%, some studies say, and so on. But that doesn't, this number doesn't give you an idea of how bad this was. Because if formerly you had a literacy rate that could go up to 80% and so on, in the practice, that meant that you had most, or at least a big portion of that population, just had bare literacy education. They learned to read and write in the first stages of the school, and there was a big dropout. A lot of students didn't finish their basic studies, so they were, from the statistical point of view, they knew how to read and write. From the functional point of view, they were quite illiterate. And you had a lot of social problems also in the countryside and so on. From the scientific and the university point of view, we had three main universities. The University of Havana, which was the oldest university, came from the Spanish time, and it had already, when 1959 happened, it had already a story of university story in Cuba, and it's still the main university of Cuba. Then you have a university in the center of the country, which is called the Universidad Central de las Villas, and that was a university that had a lot to do with the American presence in Cuba, because it was a university that was set up especially for focus on the agricultural thing and the sugarcane thing. And then you have the University of Oriente in the other side of the island. This was the three main universities. The universities at that time, quite an elite university, in the sense that very few of the common people really were able to reach the university. And even afterwards, well, all the problems that are associated with that. You had a university which was not representing black people in that university. In Cuba, we don't say Afro-Cubans, we say black people, and that doesn't have any derogatory meaning. And you didn't have much women in that universities. You had mostly white males coming from middle class to upper class sectors of society. So, and in that universities, mostly the bulk of studies were in humanities, very few science, a bit in agriculture, a bit in chemistry, some engineering, but that was not the bulk of the studies in the university. And even in these disciplines, the study curricula was quite old. As I'm a physicist, I will give you an example. In 1959, there were no physics faculty and there were no formal physics studies. We were within engineering studies and chemical studies. We were kind of a department there, and we work there were no research mostly in physics, almost no research in physics. And the curricula was classic physics. Nothing about relativity or special relativity or general relativity, nothing about quantum theory, nothing about modern physics. It was a physics that stopped more or less after Lagrange. And that's it. Now, mostly physics stopped there for what we were teaching at the university. And then in 1961, one of the first things that the revolution did, and I think this is quite symbolic of what happened afterwards. One of the first things that the revolution did was they inaugurated the National Print Institution. It was called like that, National Print Institution. In front of this National Print Institution, they put a very important Cuban intellectual, which is called Alejo Carpentier, which is one of the most, is probably the most renowned Cuban writer. And the first book he published was El Quixote. And I'd say all that to give you the context of how the revolution is not something that just is changing the economical life or whatever. It's also changing the symbolical meaning of things and the cultural meaning of things. And they started publishing a lot of books. And in 1961, there was a campaign against illiteracy. We call it the alfabetización, la campaña de alfabetización. And this was to bring to teach to read and write mostly the rural population. And then during 1961, well, from 1960 and 1961 and 1962, we sent thousands of young people to the rural areas to teach how to read and write. And this was made in the middle of a very, very acute aggression against Cuba. If you pay attention to the dates, this is in the middle of the Bay of Pigs. This is in the middle of the Maisel crisis, and this is in the middle of a civil war what's going on in Cuba, where the remnant of the forces that were in Cuba before the revolution, those who were supporting Batista, which was the dictator before the revolution, with the support of the United States, which were giving them the weapons and so on, they staged a guerrilla type of war in Cuban mountains, especially in the center area of Cuba. So all this was going on, and while we were in that, we were trying to teach the people to read and write. And but this was not an isolated thing. After that, and during that, well, I'm saying after that, but during that and after that, they started setting up schools all over the country. One of the first things they did was schools for those who were learning to read and write. They could continue studying. So just not to keep them like say, okay, now you know how to read and write, so you can sign checks. No, you read and write, and now this is the first step. We want you, and we will give you the opportunity to learn and to become professionals, if you wish to become professionals, to become technicians, to become intellectuals, and so on. So schools were set up in all the country. They were called workers and farmer schools, and there were a lot of there was a very, very big educational effort. And And within that, in 1962 started what is called the university reform. The university reform is something that was a kind of a dream for the university students and professors since the late 20s. So it had been a very long struggle from students, from young people since the 20s to make a university that could respond to the Cuban needs of development, but also that reflects the Cuban diversity and could reach all the sectors in Cuba, especially the poor sectors in Cuba. And the main goal of the 1962 reform, university reform, was to democratize the access to higher education. So the universities were open for everybody. They were given economical support for those who wanted to study in the university. They were promoted in a very steep way that those who had learned to write and read, but also those who knowing how to write and read never had a formal education after that. There was an accelerated programs to make them to get the level so they could get into the university. And the curricula of the universities was completely transformed. And we started to open careers, and well, we say careers in Spanish, but in English doesn't sound so good. We started opening disciplines in science and engineering. So the physics faculty, well, the physics studies at the beginning was a science faculty. The physics studies, chemistry studies, lot of engineering studies, mathematical studies, all that open new at the universities. And you have to see both things going on. They are open new disciplines, but then you are starting to build a mass of people who can access the university. And also together with that, there was a reform. This is more than a reform. There was a rebuild, or there was a building of a scientific institution in the country to make a scientific network. All of that with the idea that all this has to contribute to the Cuban development of Cuba in a sustainable way. So science, we had science before 1959, and it would be wrong if I say we didn't have science. We had great scientists in agriculture, we had great scientists in biology, and then we have the main and the most important scientist in Cuban history, which is called Carlos J. Finlay, which was the discoverer of the mosquito as the transmitter of the yellow fever. And we had that science, but that science was really about people, about individuals, about certain individuals. We were very, very gifted for the science, and they did in isolation mostly. They did the research and they had an impact somehow in different areas of science, especially Carlos J. Finlay in the medical research and the transmission of the yellow fever. Now we're talking about something else. We're talking about a social effort of everybody working to get Cuba created a scientific force that will be the most important force in Cuban development. There's a very early phrase by Fidel Castro, who said in these early years he was in a gathering with the Cuban Academy of Science, which was refounded. The Cuban Academy of Science comes from the Spanish colony, but it was refounded in 1962, and when it was refounded, they created new institutes within the Cuban Academy of Science in geophysics, in astronomy, in biology, in anthropology, in meteorology. Nuclear physics was very important a bit later, oceanology. I mean, we having all this fever of education, science, and all that going on in these early years, while just some months after Bay of Pigs. So again, I mean, the context is very important. Just some months after, you had a direct aggression against the country. Fidel Castro had a meeting with the scientists at the Cuban Academy of Science, and he said the future of Cuba is the future of men in science. Today we would say men and women. That was not the kind of talking at that time, but it meant women and men, and I can show that it meant that a bit afterwards. So That was his vision, and that was the vision that was transmitted, and the vision that had a bunch of people at that time, which was it was a very bold dream. You had a country which was a very undeveloped country, a country that only produced sugar cane, and a country that, fortunately enough, the revolution put a stop to that. A country that was going towards being Las Vegas, and a country that was going towards being a prostitution paradise. That was Cuba, and that was Cuba during Batista dictatorship. And you don't have to believe me; you have to see Godfather Part Two to see how that's reflected in the film, and that this was the vision of those who governed Cuba before 1959, and the vision of Cuba that had those who came after 1959 was the complete opposite, making Cuba a country of science. So that's the context. In 1964, there was created a technical university, a university of technology, which is called Jose Antonio Echeverria, and all the engineering got out of the University of Havana, went to this university. So the building that had engineers, which I have to say today is the physics faculty building, this building became a whole university after that, a big university after that. You had, well, I told you already, you have the refoundation of the Cuban Academy of Science, and all this is going on. All this is going on. And of course, this takes some years. I mean, you're trying to build a mass of people, you're trying to build a number of people who can access to the university, who can study, then they finish the studies, and then they specialize and so on. So this takes a number of years. At the same time, we started sending students to the former Soviet bloc to study science. So also thousands of students went to the Soviet Union, went to the DDR, went to Hungary, to the Czechoslovakia at that time, and so on, to study scientific careers, to study scientific disciplines. When all these students started coming back in the 80s, then we have an explosion of science in Cuba. A lot of institutes were created, and let's say all these efforts started to pay off. So we had a lot of things going on there, and the science push never stopped. The science push really never stopped, because again, remember those words: the future of Cuba has to be a future of men and women in science. So that vision has never left us. So you can imagine that if that's your vision, you put a lot of effort into that. And just to finish and not make this answer more longer, I have to say, for example, just as an example of this push has never ended, in 2002, we inaugurated, well, I said we had 3 universities. At some point, we had 14 universities, 1 university in each province of Cuba. So from 3 universities, we went to 14 universities. And we went to dozens of scientific institutes. A lot of them, well, mostly all of them, some exceptions, especially at the university, which is more academic oriented and so on. The other kind of institute with a very specific focus in applications, in agriculture, in health, in energy development, and so on. No, and so you had a lot of scientific institutions coming into light. You had all this university effort and education effort. We built and we inaugurated what was called vocational, we call it like that, vocational science schools. That was for the studies before getting into the university. I think in the United States was something called like college or something like that. And we built in every province a special boarding school for those students who wanted to study science, who wanted to study science and engineering. And the students there got specialized education in science, in mathematics, in practical things that prepare them better for getting into science and engineering careers afterwards. So you had all that in our province. You have everything that I'm telling you. We also started making what we called pioneer palaces. We call pioneers, and that's kind of a Cuban tradition. We call pioneers to the young people, to the children. No, those are the pioneers of the future. So we call it the Pioneer Palace. This Pioneer Palace was is extracurricular activities where the students get there and they can start doing. We call it. The word in Spanish is kind of for me hard to translate. It's called círculos de interés. It means something small groups, and they have their kind of a mentor, and they do something in some specialized things, like they do school experiments in physics or in chemistry, or they do some engineering things and so on. It depends what these children like to do. So all this effort, if you see, it's a whole system of how to build human resources in a broad scale, in a social scale, to get people into science, STEM, science and technology in the university. And I was going to finish saying that we inaugurated in 2002. We inaugurated the last university that has been built in Cuba. It's called the Informatic University, the University of Informatic Science. And this university, it's a university countrywide. They get students from all the country. It's a university that has a lot of residents. So the students that come from outside Havana, they have a place to live. In Cuba, completely different from other countries, and perhaps in Europe this is more common, but certainly it's not the common thing in the United States. In Cuba, you don't pay for being in the university, you get paid for being in the university. So students that get into the university, they get a kind of a scholarship while they're studying, but also those students that live far away from the university, or those students that have economical problems at home, they get a place to live near the university. They get an allowance for food. So they get food every day. I mean, that's breakfast, lunch, and dinner, free of cost, and they can pay for that. And the only thing they give backwards, they have to give in return, is they have to study, and they have to get there. They have to graduate themselves. No, and the last university was this University of Informatic Science, and this school was made also. It was what we call, let's say, after we were getting out of this special period, this school was built because we had the vision that informatics was going to be, already was at that time, was showing itself to be the future. So we built this University of Informatic Science, and we said, okay, let's get students from all the country. And there was a city built around this university. And students came from all over the world. And one of the conditions that was put to the university was you have to have students from every district in the country. Not only the big cities in the provinces, not only the small cities in the provinces, every district in the country, the most remote district in the most remote place in the country, you have to have students from there. So that was one of the conditions. You have to have students from all over the country coming into this university. That's the last, let's say, big effort in university building that's been done in Cuba, and it's still going on today very successfully. It was also a bold vision of how these students were going to study at the university, because they made a model of you study, but also within the first years of the university, you study in real production projects, in software production projects. So the students were studying and they were working, and they were in real project, software projects and informatic projects that gave up to software solutions for Cuba and for the Cuban industry, the Cuban economy, and so on. So that's the idea. I mean, I hope I give you an idea of, and I hope you get the idea of what's the difference between before 1959 and after 1959 in terms of science and education in Cuba.
Yeah, thanks very much. Not just the difference between the old and the new Cuba, but the difference between Cuba and many other countries that we might compare that have a very different kind of system. Really, this is an inspiring overview of what education and science could be for so many other countries. So let's turn to the effects of all those years of the US blockade and the current, what we might call the siege of the Trump administration, which is, of course, an even worse kind of aggression. The effects of the blockade on Cuban science generally, and beyond science, on the daily life of Cuban people like you and your friends and family.
Okay. Again, let me give some context. The United States sanctions against Cuba are not new. They come from as early as 1960. The first sanction economical sanctions against Cuba was officially signed by Kennedy. But before that, we already had an aggression going on in the economical front. I already talked about other fronts, the military area and so on, but in the economical front, Eisenhower started by sanctioning Cuba by reducing the amount of sugar that the United States was going to buy from Cuba, no? And the blockade as an official policy of the United States government started in 1961. The historians can correct me there, the exact date and so on. And after this first law, over all these years, there've been a pile up of different laws with different sanctions over all kind of law and law provisions in the United States. So now today, what we call the blockade is quite a complicated network of sanctions that are scattered through American legislation. So even if we focus today in certain legislations which are the most damaging one, you have to understand that the economical sanctions, the financial sanctions of the United States against Cuba is a network of sanctions that are scattered in the United States legislation and has been building up sometimes kind of a random way in the sense that you have a provision of a sanction in this law that has to do with something in energy, or this other law that has to do with agriculture, or this other law we have to do with something else. So it's scattered all over the place. And what has happened is, since the Clinton administration signed, well, before the Clinton administration, there was a first step of a more aggressive policy in sanctions against Cuba after the fall of the Soviet Union, and that came in the form of a law which it's called the Torricelli Law. The Torricelli Law had the first instances of extraterritorial reach of American laws. So the Torricelli Law was the first law that said to people from other companies and so on and governments, not from the United States, that if they did certain things in Cuba or with Cubans, they will be sanctioned. One of the things, for example, is if any ship that arrives in a Cuban port will be banned to go to an American port in 6 months. So you can imagine a country like the United States that has the biggest share of trade in the world. If you're saying to the ship owners, if you send the ship to Cuba, that ship is banned from going into the United States for 6 months. And if you look at the world map, and if you look at the size of Cuba, you can imagine that a ship that, for example, is coming from Asia or is coming from Europe to Cuba, while they're coming to Cuba to pick something or they're bringing something to Cuba, they have United States just 180 kilometers from Cuba. So it's very natural to say, okay, I pick some things in Cuba, I pick some things in the United States, and I go back, or I'm bringing some things to Cuba and I'm bringing some things to the United States. Now you're telling to that ship, no, you cannot do that. Not only in this trip, but in the next 6 months. And that means that this ship owner will say, okay, Cubans, I will send you the ship, but you have to pay me for 6 months of this ship work, of what this ship would have bring to me if it would be have been allowed to go to the United States. So we are paying not the price of one trip, we're paying 6 months for one trip. And the law started, well, this came before this law just step it up. If any product, you are in another country, you are in France, and you are importing Cuban sugar to make candies, you cannot sell those candies to the United States. Any product, doesn't matter from where it is, it has more than 5% of some Cuban raw material, cannot be sold to the United States. But not only that, it also says any product that has any type of intellectual property of United States, any patent, any technology, cannot be sold to Cuba. So that means if I'm selling a plane to Cuba, and this plane is a plane built in Europe, the motor is European, the whole plane is European, but the air conditioner, the catering equipment, the seats have an American patent, you cannot sell the plane to Cuba. That's what we're talking about. That's the blockade. And this started, I mean, it was some build up of sanctions, but it really had a very strong step up by the Torricelli law after the fall of the Soviet Union. But then came, during Clinton time, it got even worse. They approved a law which is called the Helms-Burton law, that was even more drastic in that sense. It was really a complete extraterritorial law. It said any financial transaction you make with Cuba will be sanctioned by Cuba, by United States. It said seems like if you're a businessman and you work in a company in Japan, and what you're doing with Cuba, we believe is against American interests. It's not that I'm sanctioning the company, it's that you cannot come into United States as a person. It's more than that. It's that your family cannot come to United States because you are working in a company that's having an economical tie with Cuba, which we believe is against the United States interests. That as far it goes in the Helms-Burton law. The Helms-Burton law also said the following thing. It says, those that not American citizens, those that live in Cuba and think that the Cuban Revolution took measures that were against them in the economical area, and I can say a bit about that, what that means in reality. They can make a claim in a United States court. I mean, this is something that is happening in Cuba. You are not even an American national when this happened, but then you can go to an American court and you can sue the Cuban government in an American court for something that didn't happen in the United States. So you're saying the American court has jurisdiction of what's happening in another country. And what meant that a Cuban measure that affected some Cuban national from other countries that was in Cuba. That meant Cuba, mostly all the land was in the hands of very few people. So you had the rural population, the farmers, was starving. They were not entitled to get ownership of the land. You had few families that were the barons of the land, and they owned the land, no? And Cuba made an agricultural reform. And the agricultural reform meant that the farming land is going to be redistributed to those who work the land. But it was not done in an arbitrary way. It was done due to a law in Cuba of 1940, not the law of the Cuban Revolution, a law of 1940. And that law had a provision that those owners were going to get paid for those lands. And Cuba started paying the owners of those lands. And the same goes to other companies. Cuba nationalized several companies due to a law of 1940. It was a lawful nationalization. And this nationalization had a provision that those owners had to be paid for that. And they were paid, except there were English companies, French companies, Japanese companies, Spanish companies. They all were paid, except the American companies. And why? Because the American government refused for any negotiation of payments. So when today the American government says we make the embargo, as they call it, because Cuba seized American properties, we tell them that's a lie. We negotiated with all other countries and we came to an arrangement of how to pay for all that. You were the ones who refused that because you thought that the revolution was not going to last and you thought you could overthrow us. And they also say, for example, that these payments were made undervaluing the companies. And then we say the payment were made according to the value those companies said their company had to the Cuban tax institution. So if you say that your company costs, that the value of your company is $10, so you will pay only $1 of taxes. And now I'm telling you, okay, you said it was $10 during all these years. Now here are your $10. And they say, no, my company is not $10. My company is $1 million. Then why did you say for the last 10, 20 years that it was a $10 company? Because that allows you to pay only $1 of taxes. So that's the real story behind all these things. And then getting back, I speak too much. Then getting back to the question is, then we had the Helm-Burton law. And the Helm-Burton law was a really very tough law. And this very tough law meant, and then I get into science again, this very tough law meant, for example, that for us it's very difficult, extremely difficult to buy scientific equipment. First of all, United States is the biggest producer of scientific equipment in the world. So forget about all that equipment. And some of those equipments are unique. So if you don't buy it to an American company, you cannot buy it anywhere else. But tell me of one scientific equipment that doesn't have in their making some patent that is a patent in the United States. So buying those equipment gets extremely, extremely difficult. And then over all that, you have the pressure that when you get somebody who's willing to sell you an equipment, then they get a direct threat from the American embassy in that country that says don't sell that equipment. And I have personal experience on that. We have had, for example, we have arranged to buy X-ray diffraction equipment from European companies, and they send an offer, we agree on the price, we went there, we saw the equipment, everything is okay, everything seems to be going smoothly, and then suddenly the company stopped communicating with us. Zero, zip, suddenly silence. We start sending them, well, now today, emails, before fax, and so on. Please, let's close the agreement, let's make the payment, and so on. Silence. And then we find out in this has happened to me at least 2 times. And in one of this, I got like a personal message from one of the people we were talking with, and he told me, sorry, we cannot say anything officially, but we have been told not to sell you. So you're talking about the impact, that's an impact. But it doesn't stay there. The results of our scientific research and the application of our scientific results, for example, in medicine, which is the main scientific application field of science in Cuba, medicine and health, they pressure countries not to buy Cuban pharmaceutical products. So they are trying to avoid that those Cuban scientific results that get into products doesn't reach other countries. And this is really criminal because even some of these medical pharmaceutical things are unique in the world. So they're telling weak countries, especially underdeveloped countries that cannot put up a fight against the United States. They're telling you, don't buy this medicine that will save life in your countries because it's Cuban. That's what the blockade means. But not only that, in the United States, we have unique products in cancer treatments. We have unique products in other areas, Parkinson's disease and neurological disease now, Alzheimer and so on. Diabetic people. We have a unique medicine for saving the limbs of diabetic people, which is a problem for diabetic people, and a lot of diabetic people get their limbs amputated because of consequence of diabetes. And we have a medicine that has been able to reduce the number of amputation up to 70-80%. You cannot buy it in the United States. The blockade doesn't allow the American people to reach a medicine that can change the quality of life, or to reach a medicine like we have cancer vaccines that are unique in the world, and the American people cannot reach those medicines that could mean a longer expectancy of life for them. That's what the blockade means. It's not only a blockade against Cuba, it's a blockade against the world. And I think that's important also to transmit that it's a blockade to the world. And because of an obsession with Cuba that the United States government has against Cuba. And it's not only this administration, it comes of 60 years. What has happened with this administration is that this administration has been the most aggressive American administration against Cuba in history. And they now have somehow spared with all the political discourse that tries to somehow hide the real intent of the blockade, and they come in a quite straightforward way saying, we are going to, even we're going to make a military aggression against Cuba, and we're going to try to drown the Cuban people because we want them to change to a government that we like, because we want them to obey our rules, and that's it. And we do it because we can. And Trump has said it that quite plainly, not only in the case of Cuba, but in general. He said, I do it, and my only limitations is my morality, which is kind of it's not a very strong limitation in the case of Trump. No? So that's the situation right now. And of course, in this year, they started in January with a criminal, if the blockade is criminal, this is genocidal. They said no fuel to Cuba. Cuba is an island. Cuba is a small island. It's a small island beside the United States. So now they have warships going around Cuba to avoid ships carrying oil to get into Cuba. And Cuba imports mostly all the oil it needs because we don't have very big oil fields. We have some, but we don't have very big oil fields. And now we are only depending on what we can produce. And that means blackouts of 20, 30 hours. That means almost no transportation. That means fuel and electricity. We're not talking about the economy, which is shattered. We're talking about hospitals. We're talking about schools. We're talking about transportation of food. We're talking about agricultural production and so on. All that right now, all that is in jeopardy because of this extreme aggression against our country. And it's not, they say, no, we are sanctioning the Cuban government. That's a lie. You're sanctioning the Cuban people. You're making a collective sanction and a collective aggression against 9-10 millions of Cubans, not the Cuban government. Because when we suffer the blackouts, we are the ones suffering the blackouts, the 10 million Cubans. So in that conditions, and I also have to emphasize that because you read now in the news, Cuba is in the brink of a humanitarian crisis, Cuba is collapsing and so on. And I have to say, life in Cuba right now is extremely difficult. Life in Cuba right now is in a survival mode, but we are not collapsing. The university is still open. We are teaching. Now we don't have the students in the classroom, but we are using the same technology we are using for this interview to keep the lectures going on. We have distributed the university education in all the districts in Cuba, so the students can go to some we call it municipal university venue, and they get there some lectures. And for example, for physics, that's not very difficult because we have a small faculty, so we have just a couple of hundred of students. And for us, organizing that is not that difficult. Other type of discipline is more difficult, of course. And we keep teaching them. We keep giving the lectures. I just finished my semester lecture in electrodynamics. We did it in a virtual way, and we did everything visually. And the students had access to all the materials. And we had, like this interview, we had encounters periodically, and we had exchange and so on. And the student had they had by the computer and so on, they could have some platforms and where we can exchange, and they can ask me things and I can answer them and so on. Of course, these are not the ideal conditions, but the main decision we made is we won't give up. So the university is open, we still are working. And right now, for example, just in the last weeks, 4 students of mine made the graduation dissertation, and they defended their graduation dissertation with the maximum grades. And I have several students doing the master degree, and they keep working on the master degree, and have several students doing PhD, and they keep working on the PhD, and they keep graduating and so on. And that's not only my case, that's the case of mostly every professor at the university. So we are in survival mode, we are not collapsing. We have made a silence, we are making a silence revolution in transforming the energy infrastructure of Cuba towards solar energy and towards other renewable energy. We are stepping up the production of oil in Cuba. Cuba is long known for their sustainable agriculture, which uses much fewer chemicals, aggressive chemicals, to be scientific correct, aggressive chemicals that uses more organic type of products for the agriculture and so on. No, we are stepping that up, so we can still produce agriculture crops and so on. That means does that mean that the production is not down? Of course, it's down. It's heavily down, the production of agricultural products. You don't have oil. You don't have how to transport the food for the animals. You don't have how to transport the fertilizers for the agriculture. You don't have Cuba doesn't have big rivers, so the irrigation of the crop fields have to be artificially made, and that means oil. You have a problem with that, no? So but in spite of that, we are finding solutions for each problem, and today we are in survival mode, but we will overcome. What we have to avoid is a military aggression against Cuba. Leave us alone. We will manage. We say to the United States, leave us alone. We will manage to overcome, and we will overcome. And that's kind of, you asked me about the situation in Cuba. That's the situation in Cuba. We are not collapsing. We are surviving, and we are struggling. It's hard. It can get even harder, but we won't give up. We will overcome.
Thank you for that. That really does complement a lot, as you say, the news that we've been hearing, that Cuba is on the edge of collapse. And those of us who have been to Cuba and know the history know that Cubans have learned how to survive under very harsh circumstances, as you've described in this special period, and find solutions, as you say, right? I think our viewers would be interested to know what they can do to help stop this aggression, this siege against Cuba. I mean, as scientists, as a scientific community, is there a special role that they can play in not just supporting Cuban science, but supporting the Cuban people more generally? Is there any kind of special clout that scientists might have in this regard?
Well, if you're in the scientific collaboration is essential for Cuban science, for all the things that I have mentioned before. For example, the access to state-of-the-art equipment, we don't have it in the country. We do it through collaboration. Sending young people to study abroad is very important for us. Right now, I have 6 students of mine in Germany, for example. Some of them already finishing their PhD, and some of them starting and so on. And that happens to almost all professors. We send our students abroad so they can get in touch with state-of-the-art equipment, but also with with an environment of scientific environment that is very hard to find in Cuba because of all these shortcomings we're talking about. No? So there they can have exchange with other students, they can have an exchange, they can go to conference and so on, which from Cuba is quite difficult to do because of we cannot send people to international scientific conference. We don't have money for that, for paying the inscription, for paying the staying there and so on. So everything that fosters, everything that improves collaboration for us is very important. For Cuban science is very important. Everything that has to do with joint projects, with helping us keep on doing science and keep us building human resources and getting young people into science through the collaboration for us is extremely important. No? This has to do with something you asked before, but then I'm seeing some numbers here, and I had it on the computer, and I didn't mention it. I want to mention it now, and also give some context on what we're doing and so on. It has to do with the question you're asking. In Cuba, there's around 90,000 people working in science. That means technicians and everybody, every person involved in science. For a country of 9 million people, that's a lot. That's a lot. But let me tell you that 56% of those people working in science are women. And UNESCO recognized that Cuba is one of the 7 countries in the world, it's among the 7 countries in the world that has achieved the best parity, gender parity in science. So I would like to give you that context. We have around, the numbers vary a bit, but around 50,000 women in science in Cuba. And 38.4% of, we're not talking about of women working in science, but we're talking about women as science leaders. 38.4% of scientific leaders in Cuba are women. And I wanted to give you that perspective also to you understand that somehow that this is a science and this is what you can be supporting when you are when you do something in favor of Cuba. No? Well, I was talking about collaboration is very, very important. Donations are very important. Equipment donation is very important. Those equipment that you have decommissioned because you have bought new equipment and so on, but they're still functional. Getting those equipment into Cuba, that could be important for not only for research, also for studying. There's been a revolution in instrument in the last 20 years, and we all know that in all fields of science. And we have new, better equipment. In the last 20 years, there's really been a revolution in the instrumental side of science. We missed mostly all that revolution. We haven't had really a big input of equipment in the last 20, 30 years. And that means that our students are lacking a training in that kind of areas. And from my field, microscopy, for example, and all the revolution that has been going on in microscopy, our students have missed that. So we have to send them abroad to learn that. And of course, we can only send a few abroad to do that. You cannot send dozens or even hundreds of students abroad. So you send what you can send. You know? So our students are lacking this kind of experimental training. Even though we still give them, let's say, the theory of it, they cannot put their hands onto the equipment. So donations for us are very important, not only for research, but also for studying. No? And of course, everything, I mean, science collaboration has been a very strong thing in Cuban history from 59 to now, even in a political sense. During the Cold War, during all this special period after the demise of the Soviet Union, science was an island of collaboration between Cuba and the United States. It proved that we could work together. It proved that there are bounds and there are bridges that can be built based on good faith, based on common goals, and based in a sense that science is for humanity. Science is not for a political stand, it's not for a particular ideology. Science is for the better of everybody. And that has been, let's say, I will say that has been the sign of scientific collaboration between Cuba and the world, especially between the Cuban scientists and the American scientists. And right now, for example, there's a important joint project between the Roswell Park Center in Buffalo and the Cuban Center for Immunology in a cancer vaccine that's been clinically tested in the United States. It's a very promising vaccine for lung cancer. And this is a project that's been going on for several years. It's a clinical trial, and the results are staggering. And that can benefit not only Cuba, not only the United States people, it can benefit the whole world in something as delicate as cancer treatment. No? This kind of project shows in a practical way the things that can be done. And also, I've been talking about the scientific collaboration, I've been talking about this project, but also science, I think, can be a bridge of pressure, and can be a bridge of friendship, and can be a bridge of humankind values. And that can also be done if you, especially the American scientists, if you raise your voice against this collective punishment, if you raise your voice against this idea that force is the way to move forward in the relations between countries. And of course, Cuba is not a perfect country, and the United States is not a perfect country. We had a lot of things to improve in Cuba, and we have a lot of things to improve in the United States. And we have things that we are not proud of, as the United States has things they are not proud of. But we do not go to the American government and say, if you don't do this and that, we will punish you, we will sanction you, and if still you keep on, we will invade you, or we will make some terrorist attack or whatever. Don't do the same to us. And I think that kind of discourse is important to transmit that kind of discourse. We're not saying we are a perfect country. We're saying leave us alone. Let us, to the American government, leave us alone. Let us solve our problems by ourselves. And we will solve a lot of problems by ourselves. We've been solving problems in the last 60 years. Because in spite of all this narrative about Cuba being a failed country, if you look into the numbers, Cuba is far away from being a failed country. In the context of Latin America, Cuba is a success country. You don't have the numbers in education we have in Cuba in any other country in Latin America. You don't have the numbers in health that you have in Cuba in any other country in Latin America. You don't have the access of women to STEM and to education in general that you have in any other country in the world and in the Latin American region. You don't have the social security that we have in Cuba that you have in any other country in Latin America. So Cuba is far away from being a failed country, in spite of this narrative that is reproduced over and over again by the American media and the American government that Cuba is a failed country. We are far away from a failed country. And even our economical failures, you cannot blame on us. Blame them in your aggression. Leave us alone. If we are such an economical failure, leave us alone. We will prove that we are incompetent, or we will prove that we can manage to get out of this hole. If we are a failure, why do you punish us economically? Let us fail. Let us fail. And every time you ask that to them, they keep silence. So if you're an American scientist, asking your university, your colleagues, your scientific society organization, let's say, independent of ideological position, independent of political position, independent of your own idea about this could be better or worse in Cuba, this could be improved, this could be done in another way, the political system could change in that direction or this direction, independent of that. Just from a point of view of even of the human values that science promotes. talking about leave Cuba alone is an important message. And if you can transmit that message to your representative, if you can transmit that message to the American government, if you put that pressure into your American government, we're not asking for something special. We're not asking for a special treatment. We're just asking, leave the blockade, stop the aggression. Let us move forward. And I would say that's the biggest contribution that especially American scientists can do in this time to help Cuba. Avoid a military aggression against us. Because when the bombs start dropping, they don't distinguish between political positions. They don't distinguish between military and civil persons. They don't distinguish between children and elderly people and communists or whatever you want to call them. They just drop and kill. Stop an aggression to happen against Cuba. And the discourse right now from the American government at this point is that they're going to attack Cuba. And that's the first thing we have to stop. That's the first thing we have to avoid that happens. We will not surrender. And I can tell you, that's a fact. We will not surrender. Even if you have a military aggression against Cuba, we will not surrender. And if you transmit also that idea, I think, and we avoid a bloodshed, I think that's the biggest contribution we can make for Cuban science right now.
Thank you very much. I know our listeners have learned a lot. And I think, as you said, it's very important that people hear the side of people in Cuba, and that this can undo a bit of the propaganda they get from a lot of the Western media that you talked about. So I've enjoyed our conversation very much. And as I say, I hope that lots of our members and others will watch this and learn and take action, the action that you've described. So thanks for joining me, and good luck with your work. And let's hope that the United States chooses to let Cuba live, as you said.
Thanks to you, and thanks for this opportunity to give at least my perspective, and I'm sure the perspective of at least some of my colleagues, and I would say the majority of my colleagues that surround me. And thank you again. And I hope the next time we meet in a better situation. And even if the next time we meet person to person, and we can talk more about science and how to move in the scientific areas, which is, after all, our passion and what we live for. So thank you again, and thank you very much.
Thank you.